But from my perspective, that was my way of coming to terms with the fact that my brother was gone and he was not coming back. My whole life was different from that moment.
You are listening to the Under the Rug podcast with Nalini Tranquim.
Hello all and welcome back to the Under the Rug podcast. We have been stunned by the reception to the last few episodes and can't wait to go deeper into the important subjects. Now, today's conversation will touch on sensitive issues surrounding death and childhood trauma, so please listen at your own discretion. Grief is an incredibly difficult thing to circumnavigate. We all experience it at one point or another, and its effects can have a lasting grip on us for years on end. So how do we learn to live with grief? How do we overcome it? Could we be living with grief without even knowing it? And what are the appropriate steps necessary to mourn the things that we have lost? Nalini will be sharing with us from the heart, and we hope today's conversation will be both informative and encouraging for those struggling with the trappings and intricacies of grief. Nalini, how are you doing today?
I am good, and I am super excited actually to be talking about this topic because it's something that, it's a journey obviously that I've had to travel for myself in many different contexts actually. So yeah, I'm looking forward to unpacking this today.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I think we might start simple then. What is grief?
Okay, so Cambridge defines grief as a very great sadness, especially at the death of someone.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to elaborate on that because that is the official meaning of it, and yeah, I think it's perfectly written.
It's definitely a starting place. Yeah. Well, with that, then your own story of grief starts quite early. Can we try and get back to where things began in your childhood with Shorty?
Yes. So, Shorty is my older brother, and his real name is Ashok, and my parents used to call him Little Ashok because he was named after my dad. And so when I was born, Shorty would have been 2 years of age. And so I grew up having an older brother. I was born into having an older brother present. So obviously I don't remember, first few months post-birth, or necessarily those really early years with him. But I do remember him becoming sick. And he'd be gone for long periods of times, and I wouldn't have any real grasp or full understanding on where he was or what was going on. I just knew something was happening. And I remember clearly observing mum and dad's sadness from that young age. And so he'd be gone for long periods of time, and then I would often be put into care with friends, and again, asking those questions asking questions to the lady that was looking after me. Where's mum and dad, and where's my brother? They would say mum and dad are going to be home soon, and not to worry about it. They're going to be home soon. And so really, I just remember having all these questions in my little girl mind. So keeping in mind now, I am around the age of 3, but not having definitive answers. And then I clearly remember mum and dad sitting me down and saying that they were going to be bringing Shorty home for a little while. So now I know from the hospital. And that I need to be very, very careful with him. And I remember him coming home and him being in a wheelchair, and that rattling me. I knew that he was very frail. So keep in mind, I'm 3 years of age. I knew he was extremely frail, not the brother that I had grown up with over the last 3 years. He looked very different. He sounded very different. He was extremely pale. And of course, he was sitting in this wheelchair and couldn't walk around on his own. And I remember being hit with that brutal reality that something wasn't okay. And of course, I still, to my memory, can remember clearly in my mind's eye, Mum showing me how to wheel him in the wheelchair around the house, and me being extremely careful not to bump the walls, and just wanting to take really good care of him. And I remember actually one picture in my mind is fixing his blanket and tucking him in, and just making sure that he was okay. And then obviously, time's obviously passing. He then ends up back in hospital because he's gone now for, again, what to me seemed like a really long period of time. And then I remember being with Mum and Dad's dear friends, Auntie Bev and Uncle Kev, who are just darling family friends of ours. And their kids were basically best friends to me as a little one. And spending time with them and having to sleep over at their house, and then waking up and playing with the boys and, hanging out with them. And then Auntie Bev calling me into the lounge this one afternoon, and she sat me down on her lap, and she said to me, sweetheart, I just need to tell you that your brother, Shorty, has gone to be with Jesus in heaven. And she told me later on that I flinched, like it did sort of like this weird sort of jerk thing, and then asked if I could go and play, and then just promptly got off her lap and went to go and play. But what I do know is that over the days, weeks, months, and what's eventuated into years, was everything shifted for me in that moment. My whole life was different from that moment.
Yeah, geez. Yeah. I mean, I guess thinking back on it in retrospect, because you talk about vividly remembering these specific feelings, like feeling that something was wrong. And when you go back to that place in your mind, go back to being 3 years old and stuff, is that the stuff that generally jumps out at you the most?
Yes, very much so. So, childhood memory is a weird thing, or adult memory is a weird thing when you're going back to your earliest childhood memories. Yeah. And quite often, those early memories will be associated with either great happiness or great sadness, I think, because it's life-defining moments that we hold on to. And for me, that was a life-defining moment, because it no longer became about me waiting for my brother to come home now. Now it was this journey of navigating, no, he's not coming back.
Yeah. And this is directly after you've almost been appointed some maternal responsibilities, because now you're helping with the wheelchair.
Yes.
You're the one tucking in his blanket at a very young age as well, mind.
Yes.
So that would have been one quick change of responsibility as a child, and then all of a sudden that responsibility comes to an end.
You know what's interesting? Hearing you say that, it's as if I shifted my maternal instincts from my brother to my parents.
Interesting.
Because that great sadness that the Cambridge Dictionary describes grief as was something that followed my parents.
Yeah.
So vividly in those early years post his death.
And we might move to that now, because I wanted to ask how Shorty's passing impacted on your childhood and teenage years, and at the time, do you feel that you were aware of the effects?
Okay, so yes, yes, it had a cataclysmic impact on my childhood. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people go through life thinking that grief only really impacts adults, people who can understand loss. But I can most certainly testify to the fact that children also feel grief, okay? So I just want to highlight that fact. So I know for me, my journey was trying to understand where he was. You know, my mum and dad, by this point, had converted to Christianity. And so mum would describe where Shorty was he's in heaven with Jesus. Okay. And I knew that my mum and dad had both fallen in love with Jesus and were on this road of beginning to understand, you know, Christianity more, and were reading the Bible more, and were just, you know, on their own journey in terms of spirituality. And so, you know, that had obviously impacted me. And I also, in those, you know, at that young age, loved Jesus, you know, because mum and dad used to speak so fondly of him. I didn't have a full understanding of who he was or where he was, but I knew heaven was out there somewhere, you know, and that Shorty was now with Jesus in heaven. And so for me, one of the physical impacts of Shorty's death was I would come home from nursery school or playgroup or whatever it was, and mum, you know, would paint the scene for me later on as we had these conversations. But I remember coming home from nursery and running straight into my bedroom where I had this most magnificent, what I describe as a Chronicles of Narnia wardrobe. And I would jump into my wardrobe, close the door behind me, and I would sit in and amongst my clothes and my jackets and, you know, my shoes and everything. And I would just curl up in the wardrobe. It's quite a vivid picture that I still hold in my mind. It's like I can still smell it. It's insane. And I would talk to Jesus in the wardrobe and ask how his day was. And because mum had described to me that Shorty had gone to be with Jesus in heaven, and I had this understanding at the age of 3 that if I could talk to Jesus and communicate with Jesus, then maybe I would still have some sort of connection with my brother, you know, and that maybe through Jesus he could communicate with me how my brother's doing, and is he okay? Is he still in the wheelchair? Does he still need tucking in? You know, and I don't know whether this was just my imagination or whether this was actually Jesus talking to me. And I'm sure maybe one day when I'm in heaven, I will know the answer to this. But I used to get this vivid picture in my mind's eye of Jesus, of Shorty playing with other children out in the gardens in heaven, and being so happy, and he's not in his wheelchair anymore, and he's full of joy, and he's full of laughter, and he's strong, and he's fit, and he's able to run and play. And doing this on a daily basis each day for me was actually therapeutic for me. But of course, for my mum and dad, it was troubling for them, you know, because they would call out, Nalini, Nalini, and I wouldn't respond because I'd be in my wardrobe having my little moment with Jesus, you know. And you know, mum would then open the door eventually and she'd be like, darling, what are you doing in the wardrobe? You need to come out and, you know, come and have something to eat and come and have some tea. And whilst I understand that now, back then I couldn't understand why she was trying to pull me out. Whereas from an adult's perspective, it's, oh, wow, my child's really, you know, kind of morphed into this hermit state. You know, I need to try and pull them out of this hermit state that they've kind of fallen into. Meanwhile, that was my way of processing my grief as a child. Now, I know I did an interview in season 1 with my mum on this very topic, so it will be a good idea for us to have the link actually for that episode in the description of today's episode, because you'll hear it from my mum's perspective, which I think is really enlightening. But from my perspective, that was my way of coming to terms with the fact that my brother was gone and he was not coming back. And it was brutal. It was brutal. But my wardrobe moments, for some reason, brought some sort of sense of comfort and closeness to him. So that was my way of dealing with it. Has it had an impact on my later years? Is that what you asked me?
Yeah, through to your teenage years.
Yes. Well, it wasn't soon. It was actually soon after that, around the age of about 3.5, 4, that Mum took me for my first piano lesson.
Okay.
And I think, looking back in hindsight, that was her way of trying to help draw me out of my grief. And honestly, I thank God for them, because I just loved the piano. And like I said, looking back now, I can see that I immersed myself in piano, and that it would have played an integral part in me being able to navigate my grief, because it was my safe place. It was something that was creative, and it was beautiful, and it soothed my heart, and I think it brought comfort to my mind as well. And it gave me something to do and to focus on, other than the loss of someone that was so dear to me.
Absolutely. I think that's a common thread for a lot of people, is using creative pursuits, not necessarily always as an outlet, but there's definitely a sense of purity, and I think it can be good to have something creative that you can kind of use to set your mind at ease.
Yes, absolutely. And I also know the effects of being trapped in grief, and that's extremely damaging, because there is an element of guilt, in a way, that if I stop grieving and if I go back to life as normal, it's like I'm being disrespectful to the person that I've lost. Right? And so sometimes there's this tug of war that takes place, where we know that our bodies need to move on, that for our well-being we need to move on, but we stay in grief out of respect for the ones that we've lost.
And I think it can even go beyond that. I think that you can become dependent on what that way of life feels like.
Yes.
It might not necessarily feel good, but there might be specific pros to having that sort of blanket over your head.
Yes, but we're also creatures of habit, So when grief is prolonged for any length of time, our body molds into that, and it becomes a habit.
Yeah, absolutely.
Where it's then quite hard to break.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But then what happens is we remain trapped in that state of grief. We then become hard to relate to our loved ones around us who are still living, and that's the thing is we still have breath, and the right to life and to living that life. Our loved ones wouldn't want our lives being cut short mentally, emotionally, physically even, because of them going, would they? I mean, if I were to ever have that conversation with my brother before he had died and gone, would you want me to continue to sit in my wardrobe for the rest of my life and grieve you? He would have said categorically, no. I want you to live your life, and I want you to give it your best shot, because you've only got one. Mine's been cut short, but you've still got yours, so live it. I know he would have said that if he could have articulated that at the age of 5. But yeah, for people who are trapped in that state of grief, don't allow yourself to be controlled by guilt or shame for choosing to move forward.
Yeah.
I think is very important to hear,
Yeah, absolutely. I guess then this was something that you and Dad had always said as we were growing up, is like the dog that grows is the one you feed, right? So I wanted to know, has his passing and that grief that you've had to deal with had continued effect on you even up until your adult life.
Yes, absolutely. Though I have to say, it was so dormant in my heart. I didn't realize it until I was faced with a different kind of grief in my adult years. And then it brought it all back.
Is that something you're willing to?
Yes, absolutely. So, a few years ago, our youngest son went through a really, really difficult time, and ended up making some extremely damaging decisions concerning his future that had a ripple effect on the rest of the family. Okay. And for me personally, as a mum, it was devastating for me on so many levels. And it actually had a knock-on effect with my mental health and my general well-being. And I think I've described it, I've explained this already before, and some of you will know this. You know, I eventually was diagnosed with chronic PTSD, and my doctor ended up putting me on a mental health care plan and referred me to a psychologist. Now, keeping in mind as well that I have continued my relationship of loving Jesus, my relationship with God, throughout my life. Okay, so from that young age right up into my adult years. So I have been a Christian all these years, okay, and still continuing to grow in my relationship with God on a daily basis. I don't think we'll ever stop that this side of heaven. So I'm strong in my spirit, man, but physically, mentally, emotionally, I am a wreck. Okay, so I am sitting with this psychologist, and I'm thinking to myself that she's going to help me unpack the damaging decisions that my son's making, how it's impacting me, give me some tools, and boom, I'll be able to move on. But what ends up happening is we end up going back into time, and the whole story of my brother ends up coming out, bubbling to the surface. And I broke during one of my sessions. I just bawled. I couldn't contain it. I had no idea I even had that level of emotion still in relation to my brother. And what I realized was I was actually grieving the decisions that my son was making, which had resulted in my son actually not really being my son anymore. It was like he had become somebody else. And what I learned was I was grieving the loss of my son. The son pre all of this. I was actually grieving the loss of him. But because he was alive, physically breathing and living, it was as if I was punishing myself and not allowing myself to grieve him. Because it was weird, because it was almost like my subconscious was saying, yeah, well, he's not dead. He's still here, so how can you possibly be grieving? You should be grieving your brother who had actually died, right? So all of this is coming to the surface, and it's so amazing how by allowing myself to just bawl that day and not care that I was in the company of a complete stranger and felt like a total idiot, by allowing myself to just let it all out, I suddenly felt like, oh my gosh, have I been carrying the burden of my brother's death throughout my whole life without even realizing it? And then only now that I'm faced with a level of grief again, it's kind of brought it back out of the trunk, as it were.
Why do you think that grief can stick with us for so long? Do you think it's the environment we're in? Do you think we intentionally try to suppress it? Do you think that we're afraid to confront the grief that's inside us? Are we distracted? What do you think about that? Because you think in that moment when you're having that breakdown, like, where was the elephant hiding? This is an incredibly small room I'm in. How has this been with me for so long? And why was I just never aware of it?
Yes. Look, I think for me, because I was a child at the time of my brother's death, there was never an opportunity for me to go and get counseling or, I mean, that was never a thing in those days, really. Like mental health in young children.
And you get swept up in the busyness of being a child, right?
Of course. And I think also because my attentions shifted from, taking care of my brother who was now not there to taking care of my parents who were grieving the loss of a child. And I almost took on the function of becoming the replacement son in a way. And was so desperately wanting to make my parents happy and to make them smile again and to, just see them do well and recover from their pain. Maybe I did close the door on my own grief as a young child, and it remained suppressed throughout my growing years. Piano masked it because I was so busy with piano, and particularly by the time I got to grade 8, I mean, I was working part-time. I was practicing and rehearsing like a good 5 hours a day. So every single day there was this rhythm, where I was back to back with things and kept myself very, very busy and very, very occupied, that I didn't have the time or the space to contemplate that there was need for grieving. Then when the wheels fell off later down the line with my boy and me, because of the effects of it, I suddenly found myself having to make the time to process.
Yeah.
And to allow myself to grieve, which I think in the society that we live in today, loved one dies, there's all this prep for the funeral, we attend the funeral, everyone goes back to their normal lives, we're still left with the sting of death in our family and in our lives, but we have to get back up because we've got to pay the bills. So we just get back to work. Friends ask, so how are you doing? And you go, yes, I'm good, thank you. I'm great. Because, now's not the time or the place to be blubbering. So we're just not given permission to acknowledge what's just happened. It's like, when someone has a car accident and they're standing on the side of the road waiting for the police or whatever's to come. You'll sometimes see people standing there in this bewildered state. I think grief has that same effect on people. But when we're not given the time to be able to process what's just happened, come to terms with the impact of it on us, and allow ourselves to acknowledge and to grieve, then it's like that state that that after the accident state that people sometimes find themselves in just gets shoved in the bottom of the cupboard, and we just have to pretend like everything's okay when it's not okay.
I think it's interesting you use a car crash as an analogy there, because I think one difficulty of mental health and processing trauma is it's not visible in the strictest sense. So if you're in a car crash and you break your leg, the recovery process is very well documented and very visible. You'll have a cast, your coworkers will be wanting to sign it. If there's something that you're unable to do, your coworkers can see that you're unable to do it, and they'll come and help, and they'll be accommodating. You go to the hospital for your checkups, they make sure nothing's getting infected. That initial shock of the impact at the very least lives on in the fact that your coworkers are aware that you've got a broken limb.
They're aware and therefore empathetic.
And they can see what they need to do to help. Whereas with grieving,
that's right,
there's no formal procedure.
That's very true.
A lot of the times people can go through something shocking and there's no formal requirement to go to a hospital.
No.
Or to see someone.
Exactly. And I know off the back of my parents' experience at losing a child, the funeral wasn't so much the hard part because they were surrounded by loved ones, and they had all that support. It was after the funeral. It was
Yeah.
after everyone had gone. It was 2 weeks later. It was 3 months later. It was the first anniversary of his death. It was his birthday, the anniversaries of his birthdays and Christmas, and, months, years later down the line, where that grief is still as prevalent as it was, if not worse, than it was in the immediate aftermath.
Yeah.
Okay? But for loved ones and society and community, I mean, they had the funeral 2 years ago. They must be over it by now. Everything's good.
Yeah, for sure. I guess that leads on then, because you've expressed that you have since given yourself the time and the space to grieve. What difference did you feel in yourself, be it physical, mental, so have you, in terms of relief or in terms of just general living,
Yes.
having been able to process? What was the before and after?
Yes.
Just so that people can be aware of what this might look like.
Okay, I will describe it as carrying a backpack filled with bricks my whole life. But because it's been on my back my whole life, I'm not even aware that it's there,
Yeah.
right? Or aware that it needn't be there.
Right.
So I've learnt to live with it, right? So I'm lugging this backpack around every single day of my life, okay? Then comes this moment in time where I am able to grieve and process and let it go. And for me, it was a 6-month journey of weekly sessions with my psychologist, okay? It was pretty intense. But throughout the course of that program, it was as if each time one brick was being removed from the backpack until eventually there was no backpack. And so the pre and the post was that heavy burden of carrying something that I'm not even aware that I'm carrying, to, that feeling like I can breathe for the first time in years. I can remember him fondly without that ache in my heart like I've had before. Yes, I still cry and I still get emotional about it, but it's not like that weightiness that I was carrying before. Yet wasn't aware, like I said, that I was even carrying it until I wasn't carrying it anymore.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Huge.
Yeah, mourning is
It's such an integral part of healing.
yeah.
It's such an integral part of healing. And listen, here's the thing, right? And I went through this myself. I didn't give myself permission to grieve the loss of my son and grieve the decisions that he was making. And for some of you, you're refusing to allow yourself to grieve the divorce or to grieve the loss of someone that you were in love with, but he or she has chosen to walk away, or it hasn't worked and you've now separated, right? Or it doesn't necessarily have to be the death of a loved one, all right, where you are then allowed to grieve. Allow yourself to grieve if that's what your body needs, if there's any kind of loss in your life right now. It could be the loss of a job, where you thought your career was set and it's fixed and it's going places, and then you get made redundant or whatever. There'll be an element of grief there because it's your body's way of coming to terms with this new reality, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that if there's anything I want to say is that give yourself permission.
Have you been burdened with grief in recent times? And if so, given that you've come through this process with Shorty, do you feel that you are more adequately prepared to both recognize what you are feeling and then carry out the grieving process in a way that was more healthy?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's nothing worse than having a keynote speaker come and speak, 10 steps to success, and it's all theoretical. You want to know from the keynote speaker, what have they actually done themselves? Don't just, quote books, give me practical hands-on experience. That's what I want, So yes, definitely having navigated loss for myself and the death of a loved one for myself has certainly equipped me to be able to come alongside other people who are grieving. Have I experienced grief recently? Yes, a very dear friend of our family lost a loved one to suicide recently. Oh, and it just floored me, broke my heart. I mean, I was weeping for days on end. So even though we weren't related, just that connection, between us and our friends and the loss of their child, conjured up all the emotion of, me losing my brother and my mum losing her son and my dad losing his son. And I was able to, and, both my hubby and I were able to grieve in a way that I don't think we would have been able to. And we were able to empathize in a way that we wouldn't have been able to had we not have gone through it for ourselves.
I think it was interesting how you worded that, because you kind of softened it a little in explaining it to our listeners, that even though it wasn't a family member, do you think that's a big reason why people continue to grieve? That they, be it due to societal norms or the way they were raised, almost put a damper on a very real feeling that they have, because they feel that, oh, well, maybe I'm a few steps removed from what happened.
Wow. Yes, quite possibly.
Because I see people do that all the time, and I do it myself, and I think a lot of people do it, where they'll kind of minimize the experiences that they've had, and because they minimize them, they never actually acknowledge how much those experiences impacted them.
Right, and in turn don't fully deal with it, and then
Exactly.
the impact continues.
Because it would be like breaking your leg and then going back to work the next day having not visited the hospital.
Absolutely.
Right?
But I think it's also, I don't know, is it a society thing where we minimize it because we need to look like we've got it all together all the time?
Yeah.
Or whether it's a self-protect mechanism. If I pretend that everything's okay, then my body will just fall into that and I'll be fine. I'll be able to suppress it and it will all be good.
Maybe someone out there has it worse.
That is a very common one, actually. I've heard that many a time where, I just need to be grateful because, so-and-so lost 3 family members with COVID last year. And, who am I to now grieve the loss of just one person? Yeah, absolutely. But that's unfair on you. That's unfair on your body and how your body is processing the loss of your loved one, right? It's different for different people. Grief hits differently for different people. I know there's the different stages of grief, and we will include links to recommended readings for you so that if you do want to do your own research and understand the different stages of grief, we'll make sure that you have those resources available. But grief hits people differently. I think the most important thing, though, is that you just allow your body that time to heal in its way and give your body that space. Allow it. If you need to go on a mountain and scream, then go on the mountain and scream. If that's what's going to help you come to terms with and put that weighty satchel on the ground and let it go, then do it. Don't take as long as I did. It took me years to come to terms with it and deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess then we might start to wind things down. For our listeners who are struggling with the problem of grief, be it a loss of life or, as you've noted, the end of relationships, it could be something that almost feels airy-fairy maybe, but like maybe the passing of golden years.
Right.
I know there's a common thread that as people tend to age, they tend to feel grief almost at a loss for the fact that their best years are behind them.
Yes.
Do you have any words of wisdom or encouragement to impart?
I think this has obviously come out clearly throughout today's episode, and that is allow yourself to grieve. And if anything has resonated with you today where you go, my goodness, that's me, I am definitely in that position right now, then you're really standing on the threshold of making that choice. Do I just bury it and carry on as things are? Or do I expose the wound to the sun, give it some sunlight so that I can heal? You know, that's so, so important. But I would like to share a poem on loss, actually, that a loved one shared with me a couple of years ago, that honestly has just been the most beautiful poem for me in terms of loss and coming to terms with the loss of a loved one. And I think I'd just like to close on that, if that's okay. There is nothing that can replace the absence of someone dear to us, and one should not even attempt to do so. One must simply hold out and endure it. At first, that sounds very hard, but at the same time, it is also a great comfort. For to the extent the emptiness truly remains unfilled, one remains connected to the other person through it. It is wrong to say that God fills the emptiness. God in no way fills it, but much more leaves it precisely unfilled, and thus helps us preserve, even in pain, the authentic relationship. Furthermore, the more beautiful and full the remembrances, the more difficult the separation. But gratitude transforms the torment of memory into silent joy. One bears what was lovely in the past, not as a thorn, but as a precious gift deep within, a hidden treasure of which one can always be certain. Isn't that beautiful?
That's wonderful.
So beautiful.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
To all our listeners, I hope you're encouraged by that. We'll have a link to Nalini's episode from season 1 where she spoke with her mum. Can't recommend that enough. And where can people find you?
So if you want to reach out, please do. You can either drop a comment if you're watching this on social media, drop a comment in the comments field below. Otherwise, flick me an email, info@nalinitranquim.com. You can also learn more about what I do on my website, nalinitranquim.com. I love you. I'll talk to you soon.
To learn more about Nalini's online coaching programs, visit nalinitranquim.com/store. Thank you for listening to the Under the Rug podcast with Nalini Tranquim.